Thank you for joining us on this special episode of Natural Pigments. And we're going to be talking about, will lead white soon be unavailable? And it's a little bit of an ominous title for this discussion, but I think it's very important that we address this and make our customers and in the general public aware of what is happening with lead white, because many of you probably have tried to order lead white not only from Natural Pigments but from other companies and found that it's not available, it's out of stock, and there's perhaps very little explanation been given for this. And I felt it would be very important to provide an explanation because lead white, after all, is a very important color for artists who are painting in oils. And the discussion, and this is just a really informal type of discussion, I prepared a few things so that visually, so that you can help understand some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But the discussion is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research into lead white recently in the past about 20, 30 years, and some important things that we need to note about lead white. And in addition to that, then I'll talk about the industry overall. And I also want to talk a little bit about the history of how lead white is made. And then we have some good news too towards the end of this episode. So let's start off with a little presentation that I've prepared here for you. And we're going to be addressing recent changes in the availability of lead white. But what's the importance of lead white? Why do we talk about it so much? And especially with Natural Pigments, you know that we emphasize the importance of lead white in oil painting. And I need to emphasize that fact. We're talking about its importance in relation to oil painting. The importance in relation to other painting mediums, it doesn't have the same importance because it doesn't have the same properties in other painting mediums. But what has been noted, and this is based on scientific research studies that have been done, and what we can observe in paintings that are hundreds and hundreds, centuries old, that properly formulated, cured oil paint films are remarkably stable polymer systems lasting hundreds of years. And we've noticed this. We see this. We see this in paintings of the early Netherlandish artists who were painting in the 14th, 15th centuries. And the condition of their paintings is quite remarkable. And many of them needed practically no intervention until the 20th century, so 500 years later. So this is a remarkable thing because we don't see this with many other painting mediums today. Today in in museums and about. So that is a very important piece of information. And there was at this point in time, we do not see any other pigment that has the same properties in oil paint. And that's an important thing to note. Lead-containing paints made from lead white have noteworthy stability. And that's really the key point of using lead white in oil paint today, despite its toxicity. And the toxicity is, of course, an issue. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for professional artists, we believe that it's very important to use lead white especially, in paintings, despite its toxicity. But artists are able to really prevent being exposed to the toxicity of lead white. It's quite simple with basic studio hygiene. And despite their longevity, lead-containing oil paints tend to form soaps. And this has been recognized for well over probably 100 years. That the soaps, which are a chemical combination of the metallic lead with the components in oil, form soap. To form a soap, we as we learned probably in grade school, the soap is formed using a fat and an alkali. And so combining them forms a soap. So, and the same thing happens with metals, certain types of basic metals, and they form soaps when they're combined with oils. And this has been repeatedly measured over and over again. The metal soaps can play both a positive role as anchor points during the paint drying, which leads to the maturing of the oil paint system and its stability, but has also been responsible for certain degradation processes. And this is really what has been noted in the last couple of decades, that lead soaps can also lead to certain types of degradation products. These products include protrusions in the paint film. They include darkening, which is as a result of the increased transparency of the paint, as well as other effects. But I have to emphasize too that a lot of these adverse effects or these degradation processes are not just caused by lead. They're also caused by zinc, and in a few more rare cases by other types of soaps, such as calcium soaps, and even more rare are copper soaps. So I need to emphasize that not all the information that we read, and you're probably, if you are part of the Painting Best Practice group on Facebook, you're probably aware of a lot of these information, because we try to bring this to the forefront and make artists aware of both the advantages and sometimes their disadvantages in using certain materials. What's interesting, in a paper recently which talks, the paper is entitled Lead Soaps in Paintings, Friends or Foes, it analyzed the number of scientific publications reporting on the origins and roles of metal soaps in paintings. And in the top graph, this is from that particular study. They showed the number of papers, and if you look in the green area, they show that the lead soaps, or I should say metal soaps in general, okay, so this is not only lead but also zinc and other soaps, have positive roles, and then in red have negative roles, and some papers identified that they have both roles, both positive and negative, and some of the papers in the gray showed that there was a neutral. They were neutral. They weren't saying, they were just simply identifying how to, or the papers were about how to identify the particular metal soaps or the identification of these soaps in paintings and so forth. The bottom graph shows these papers that were written specifically about paintings that were made after the 1850s. And you'll note that at the very beginning, before 1997, most of the papers were very positive about metal soaps. Now, why is this shift occurring? The shift is mainly occurring in terms of identifying, it isn't like suddenly all these degradation processes appeared after 2000. That's not the case at all. What is the case is that they're now able to identify, or beginning to identify, the roles of metal soaps in paintings, and beginning to attribute the metal soaps to some of the defects or the degradation products that are being seen in paintings. So, and this is because they have now been using, they're using more sophisticated testing and analysis methods that enable them to identify this. And so there's more information about this. And the information, the studies are not done. There's going to be continue to do this. And in fact, a couple years ago, there was a conference in Europe specifically about metal soaps. But in all this, we have to keep remembering that although metal soaps can lead to degradation in oil paint films, and by the way, in some cases, some of these some of the degradation also occurs in tempera paint films. And there is a couple of papers that have identified that. But all in all, we have to remember that there are benefits to using especially lead in oil paint films. Of course, many of you are now aware that zinc oxide or zinc white forms also metal soaps, and for the large part, these metal soaps has been identified as having negative or adverse effects on oil paint films, such as delamination and embrittlement and other types, also increased transparency quite rapidly, in fact. And so this is of course a grave concern. But with lead white in particular, and with some other lead containing pigments, we have to note that there are many benefits, and perhaps the benefits do outweigh many of the issues. The key part is to identify the true what is really causing, which this has not been totally conclusive, but what is really causing this degradation in the paint films. Because you have to remember that there's many sources of lead in oil paint films. And what's interesting is that in the 20th century, there have actually been more lead added as additives in paint films as opposed to the roles that it played as a pigment in early paintings that were done in the early centuries of the Renaissance and so forth. So a lot of the lead was also introduced not only as dryers, but also as certain types of additives to increase the wettability of the pigment in production. And this has been done primarily in the 20th century. So a lot of the defects are observed in modern paintings. And so more of this information needs to be analyzed to determine what the actual role that lead plays in terms of the source and whether the production of these effects or metal soaps can lead to the kind of degradation that they're seeing. So this is an important point. I wanted to bring this out to you. This paper, by the way, which is lead soaps in paintings, friends or foe, can be downloaded from the internet. Just look up that title and you can make it is available. It's very technical, so it may be a little bit difficult reading because it goes into a lot of organic chemistry and research, but it gives you a kind of an overview of, it's a really overview of a lot of the research that's been done. And like I pointed out, there's been hundreds and hundreds of scientific publications reporting on the effects of metal soaps. But more time will be needed to really figure out where these defects could be coming from, or the degradation in paintings, in oil paintings and in tempera paintings are coming from. And with time, and of course we'll be keeping you apprised of some of this research as time goes on. So let's move on to the next point, which is the lead white pigment supply and demand. So the main sources of lead white today, pigment, is of course commercial manufacturers, both in Europe, United States, and of course in Asia. The pigments that are for many years, lead white pigment was perhaps it was the most important pigment available for centuries, perhaps even thousands of years. And its importance in history is well noted, and especially in art history. But in recent times, in the past 20th century, there's been a major decline in lead white pigment because of its toxicity. Of course, it posed many issues, in particular issues of toxicity for children and exposure to this to workers that are working in these lead plants. And so this is something to be a big concern, and we can see that I put together, I found information about lead white production. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the century. The source of this is the mineral yearbooks that are compiled each year. That also goes into the production and consumption of many different types of minerals. And this is the white lead production between 1946 and 1970 in the United States alone. So you can see that in the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, the production of lead white pigment amounted to well over 200,000 short tons. Now, a short ton is 2,000 pounds. So that's quite a lot of lead white. And that's just lead white, and that doesn't include lead for other purposes, but that's lead white. So by 1946, it declined considerably. So something about around 70,000 short tons. And the reason for this is because different white pigments were discovered in the 1920s. Titanium dioxide was discovered. Other white pigments such as zinc sulfide and lithopone were improved upon so that they actually became better types of pigments used in paint. But the real discovery was the titanium dioxide. The titanium white proved to be a very opaque pigment and had lots of usages. It wasn't without problems, however, because initially when they introduced titanium white, it had a photocatalytic response to light and in paint films, so that it often degraded, and especially the initial forms that were introduced into paint. Later on, about the time of the Second World War, they introduced a different form of titanium dioxide, the rutile form, and improved on its light fastness, and so that about the 1940s and 50s, they began coating these pigments so that it vastly improved on its usability in paint. And therefore, as a result of that, there was a very set decline, as you can see, during the Second World War, and it continued on until the 1970s. And finally, in about the 1970s is when there was officially banned in many industrial countries, that is, lead white was banned. And so after that point, by the way, there's practically no information on the industry of the production of lead white. And the reason is because the number of manufacturers dwindled to just a couple. Obviously, because, as you can see, the number of commercial uses became less and less for lead white pigment, and hence there was fewer manufacturers. So there's really, I couldn't find much data after that point, because the data that could have been supplied would have compromised the proprietary information of the few manufacturers that were just left making this pigment. And today, there's only a couple of manufacturers in North America. Some years ago, I believe it was about 6 years ago, the one manufacturer in Europe, which was located in England, stopped producing lead white, and so lead white production had to be switched to other sources, or the lead white oil paint had to be, the source for that pigment had to be switched to other sources. And the price, of course, because of the dwindling commercial uses for lead white, the prices have gone quite a bit higher. Right now, as far as I know, there's probably, there's two types of lead white being manufactured basically today. One type of lead white is not as necessarily as a pigment, but as a chemical additive used in certain types of chemical processes. And of course, the other type is definitely a pigment. The difference has to do with the purity, somewhat of the purity, but mostly about particle size. Because using lead white as a chemical additive, the requirement there for particle size is perhaps not as stringent. But as a pigment, of course, the particle size is critical. In other words, the particle size range needs to be quite narrow. So that today most of the manufacturers in making lead white pigment have an average particle size of about 3 microns. So with that, then prices have jumped, and just this year, prices jumped considerably, and in some cases up to 4 times the amount from some of the pigment manufacturers. So this has posed a major problem for artist materials manufacturers who are trying to make and supply lead white oil paint to artists. We're forced to raise our prices because we have no choice, because we have to obtain lead white from these companies. And in fact, now these companies really, they're only keeping lead white production mainly for artist materials manufacturers, which is a remarkable thing because the amount of lead white sold throughout the world for artist materials manufacturers is barely registers. And so it's such a small amount. As a result, this year, some of the manufacturers have, and as a necessity, had to change from a regular production of producing lead white to producing it on scheduled basis depending on demand. And so quite difficult to do so. And so at the beginning of this year, the manufacturers decided to hold off production until August. As a result of that, a lot of the companies had enough supply to make paint for up to a period of time. In natural pigments, we had enough to make paint up until about August, and in which case we fell short. The good news is that they finally did resume manufacturing, and we do have a shipment of lead white coming in as we speak, and we expect to have it soon, and we'll be producing lead white again shortly. We were expecting to have it earlier. We were expecting to have it this month, but looks like it won't be available until the end of October. So in the future, we may be expecting shortages and disruption of supplies. And I'm not recommending that artists go into a frenzy and start buying lead white like we saw the purchase of toilet paper during COVID. I do not recommend that at all, because that will only increase the number of issues going on. We're going to be doing a number of things to ensure that there's going to be a steady supply. We're in discussions with the pigment manufacturers to coordinate better the supply of lead white so that we can be making it. So like I mentioned, we are going to have lead white, modern lead white, and I'm going to make a distinction of that in just a moment, available in late October. There is going to be a price increase. We're going to be deciding that in the next week or so, what that increase will look like. But that's the bad news for everybody, but we know how important this lead white is, and we're going to try to minimize the impact for artists. So what is Natural Pigments doing about all this? Like I mentioned, we are looking at coordinating the results with the pigment manufacturer. We still rely on them, and we will continue to rely on them. We're all looking at new sources, but these aren't pigment sources of lead white. These are chemical additive sources of lead white, and we've been evaluating them to use as a pigment, and we're doing some studies right now to determine that. Some of them look interesting, but they also have certain types of issues. So we're going to try to work with that and see what we can come up with, mostly as a backup rather than as our main source. And the other thing that we've been able to do is to increase the in-house production of stack process flake white. Now, during COVID, because of our responsibility to our employees to keep them safe from COVID during this pandemic period, so we had to temporarily stop our production of stack process flake white. And we needed to rearrange how we're producing it. And so we've actually invested some more into the process, and that's what we're doing now. We've actually produced a batch, and I'm announcing this for the very first time to the public. And and so it is now going to be available to you, and we've actually now we've put into effect an increase in the production of stack process, and in fact we're hoping, and we probably will be able to do this, to have it supplied on a regular basis from this point forward. You know that many times we were out, and of course in the past year and a half it was because of COVID, but primarily, but in other times the production was more difficult. It's a very labor-intensive process. And I'd like to describe what that process is now, so that some of you have read some of the articles on about the historical production of stack process flake white, and how it differs from that of modern lead white, which is in our regular range of lead white products. But I also wanted to show you a little bit about that. There is an article on the Natural Pigments website called Stack Process White Lead, the Historical Method of Manufacture. And I encourage you to read it. It's a very detailed article. It goes through the entire history of making lead white from its very beginning. And let me just mention that the pigment lead white has, as far as we know in art, always been from a synthetic source. In other words, it was made by humans, and apparently from early Greek times. Some of the earliest examples of it are in literature by Pliny the Elder, who wrote about it in his book of Natural History, and he describes the process of making it, which, by the way, essentially did not change from early Greek time until the beginning of the 20th century, when manufacturers began using a modern method of making lead white. And this modern method of lead white differs dramatically from the stack process, mostly due to the crystal formation of the lead white as well as the particle size. Here's some interesting drawings from patents on lead white production. These are US patents from the 19th century. The drawing on the left shows a clay pot that was used. And by the way, this clay pot, the example of this clay pot, is almost identical or very similar to the types of clay pots used by the Dutch. Now, the Dutch improved significantly or standardized the method of making lead white. And that's why sometimes the stack process is also called the Old Dutch method. So in about the 16th, 17th centuries, the Dutch were making lead white in a large way, and they standardized on this production. And we know about this because there are some accounts in literature about the production of lead white back then, and they're very detailed. And so we know quite a bit about how they produced it. And at Natural Pigments, we used the same basic method that was done by the Dutch in the 16th century, and reproduced it in our own factory where we now make lead white. Also on the right side is a drawing of one of these lead white sheds where the stack process was done. Now, the reason why it's called the stack process, and the Dutch really were the ones that started this, is that the lead, and the innovations that the Dutch introduced was that the Dutch cast lead into thin sheets and then coiled the sheets into spirals and placed them vertically inside those clay pots. And so the clay pot, as you can see here, the lead would have sat right on here. It sits on a little bit of a lip, or somehow is kept above this area. And in this area, this is filled with vinegar. So the vinegar sits down here, the lead doesn't touch it, and then these clay pots are lined up inside this corroding shed. And initially they call this a blue stack because the color of the lead has a kind of a bluish gray, the metallic lead does have a bluish gray appearance to it. And so these pots were placed in rows and columns, and then between the pots was horse manure. And I know that sounds quite odd to many of you. Later on, of course, they used other materials such as tan bark, but horse manure was used primarily by the Dutch, and this is again one of the innovations. There was different sources of heat and carbon dioxide and water that were introduced by previous manufacturing in earlier centuries, but the Dutch standardized on the use of horse manure and the use and putting this into rooms where the corrosion would take effect. So what happens is, and this is on the left side is a picture of this. You can see the metal coils, you can see the clay pots. We, in some of our initial research, because some of the information wasn't very particular in terms of what kind of clay, we used different types of clay pots or clay in these pots, these ceramic pots, which were typically unglazed except for the bottom of the pot, which contained the vinegar. And so we did many different types of experimentation with that. We also closed, you can see some of the pots have lids on them here. And so we closed them to determine if that made any difference in the corrosion process. But within really a very quick amount of time, the corrosion process began. And the purpose, by the way, of the manure is that it needs to, you need to generate heat so that these rooms would become quite warm. And so it generates heat. It also generates water vapor, and it generates carbon dioxide. Those are the essential ingredients to this whole process. And so the first part is that the acetic acid in the vinegar attacks the metallic lead. And then this is not a stable form of, it's also known as sugar of lead or lead acetate. And it's then converted into a basic lead carbonate, which actually consists of two components, which is lead hydroxide and lead carbonate. And that's what makes lead white. And you can see how these rolls here, within a few weeks, this is of course a little more advanced. You can see that they become, the corrosion effect becomes quite dramatic. And as the lead is corroding, it continues into the roll, so that in some cases the entire roll is consumed in the process. When you pick up these lead rolls, the lead actually flakes off, and that's where they get the term flake white, by the way. So only pigment, lead white pigment made in this form should actually be called flake white, because that's the form it actually comes in during the corrosion process. Most, of course, artist material companies call their lead white flake white, and so there is this confusion whether they're making a stack process or not. But I can assure you that these manufacturers are not. They're actually just using a modern lead white, which is now done through an entirely different process. It's either an electrolytic process or it's a chemical precipitation process done with carbon dioxide in a bath of acetic acid and litharge. So very different process, and the result is quite different. Here is an example, and I've shown this quite often in some of the classes that we've done. I've shown it, because a lot of people ask, well, what's the difference between, and of course it's a much higher price for the stack process, flake white. And so what's really the difference between the two? So this is a video from Van Wiedering's video about Rembrandt, and they were comparing modern lead white with stack process lead white. Now on the right side of this is modern lead white, and then on the left side is the stack process lead white. And you're going to see a very big difference. Now, the two pigments were ground in the same oil, so that there's really no difference there. So the difference is in terms of their behavior is in has to do with the particle shape and size of the stack process. So note here, and you can see buttery paint, kind of what you would expect from modern pigments. And now notice here the individual is tapping just the top of the paint with the palette knife, and notice the behavior of the lead white in this particular example. And you can see that it begins to flow as energy is put in, shear force is put into it. Now notice as soon as that he stops doing that and the energy is removed, it stops flowing and it freezes into position. This kind of behavior for a pseudoplastic substance like paint is called thixotropic behavior. And that's really an ideal behavior for paint, because when you brush the paint or you manipulate the paint with the palette knife, you want the paint to flow, especially with the brush. You want the paint to flow with the brush and not have to keep picking it up and dragging it. You know, I call it shoveling paint. And so what happens is with thixotropic paint, like the stack process here, is you can move it and it flows with the brush. But as soon as you stop moving it with the brush or the palette knife, it stays into position. It doesn't keep flowing and leveling out. And so that's really the property, the thixotropic property, and the benefit of the stack process lead white. And there's other benefits too. There is some indication that the particle size may have other benefits in terms of the formation or the lack of formation or the delay of formation of lead soaps, which may be an incredibly important thing as we're going to be discovering. So the good news is stack process flake white is available today on our website. And if you, and I'll put the link to it in the comments later. And if you're interested, you can obtain it now. So we have the production available now, and it's a limited production at this point in time. But like I said, we have another stack that's in process, or another batch that is actually going to be in process, and we'll have that available. And the lead white pigment also, if those individuals interested in obtaining lead white. Now this is only available right now through naturalpigments.com and our distribution point in the United States. Unfortunately, that's the only place we can sell at this point in time. But if you're interested, you can get it from there. So that's the overall information about that. And let me see. And I failed to remark that Tatiana Zaitseva is with me. And by the way, I want everybody to wish her a happy birthday. Today is her birthday. Did. Oh, good.
Everybody before you.
Good.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. So
nice.
So this is so. Tanya, what kind of questions should we consider here?
So let's go back to actually the toxicity.
Wow, so there's one in Russian too. That's pretty.
I know, and
that's great.
I already talked to Dmitry.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dmitry, for joining.
Yes, and he has specific question, and I will answer afterwards. But
sure.
Let's talk about toxicity first, and so I do want you address that.
Okay. Okay. So basically, toxicity. So I've written some information about this, not only in Natural Pigments, but also on the paintingbestpractices.com website, and about toxicity. There's concerns, of course, and the important thing to understand is to really understand, and this is important for, I can't emphasize this enough, that artists should be reading the safety data sheets of the materials that they're using in the studio so they can have a clear understanding of all of the products. And one of the things that we should always assume is that there is no such thing as non-toxic. because and unfortunately the term is often used in a marketing way without very little regulation, so that just to give you an example, something that may be considered to be non-toxic in one form or application is clearly not so in a different application. So that's an important point to note. And one of the things I talk about, excuse me, is about spike oil. A lot of people call it, of course, it is generally considered or regarded as safe, called GRAS, generally regarded as safe, and is considered to be non-toxic. But you have to keep in mind that that substance or that designation is given to it in its most common applications, which is in aromatherapy and as in scents and perfumes and in food. So there they use minuscule amounts of that product. And so it is at that point generally regarded as being safe. However, the way artists are using it as a solvent may introduce a whole different level of concern and toxicity in that form. And so that's just an example of what I'm talking about here. So we obviously know the dangers and the toxicity of lead, and we will never underplay that. I never do that. And so I always encourage artists to definitely protect themselves from being exposed to it. But keep in mind that lead white in the form of paint, not in powder form, which poses a whole new set of issues, can be safely handled. And of course, the way to safely handle it is to the best way to do that is to wear gloves. And there are no vapors emitted from lead white oil paint, so you don't have to wear a respirator to do that. Avoid sanding paint or causing any kind of dust or heating it up in some way so that you can avoid then creating a vapor of it. But at normal temperature and in normal studio use, it doesn't pose that kind of problem. And so the main thing to do is to avoid ingesting it. And that's relatively easy to do. We just don't put it in our mouth. And that's why when you use it, always wash your hands carefully. Even if you are wearing gloves, you want to wash your hands afterwards. But especially if you decide not to do that, you definitely want to wash your hands thoroughly and make sure you get under your nails to remove all traces of that. Also, you might want to consider using products certain soaps that remove lead from surfaces. And one of the biggest dangers in any kind of toxic product, in use of toxic product in a studio or work environment, is what I call secondary contamination. In other words, when you're using the product, you're aware of the product and you are certain to avoid ingesting it or putting your hands in your mouth or in your nose or your ear or something of this nature. And so you're aware of that and you definitely avoid that. But if you fail to clean the surfaces, such as perhaps a table where you were mixing on or some of your tools, and you fail to clean it well, and then you go back with ungloved hand and unaware that these items are present there, you then can ingest some lead at that point. So, and that's what I call secondary contamination. So to avoid that, simply clean the surfaces and tools that you're using, and also use there's a kit. We sell it on our website, but it's available from many other locations. It's a lead test kit. Very easy to use. It just involves two components, A and B part. You spray the A onto a cotton swab, and you spray the B part onto the cotton swab, and then you wipe that on any surface where you suspect lead is, even if the lead is invisible and it's just a microscopic amount of it there. It will turn a bright yellow. So that's an indication that there's some lead there, and it's always good. We use it in our factory after we clean up and we wipe down all the surfaces. And once a month we do an audit where we go through the factory and we just take it and wipe door handles, phones, everything like that, just to determine if there's any lead present. We've never found lead present in other items. Only in some cases in the work area there might have been, after a cleanup, there might have been some lead present. And that's why we do that, in order to ensure that it's thoroughly clean and there's no secondary contamination. This is very easy to do and doesn't require, scientific knowledge and so forth. It's now so easy to avoid becoming exposed to lead. And again, we need to emphasize that lead should only be used by adults who can read the safety information on the label of paint and the safety data sheets, and should not be used by minors or adults that are incapable of understanding the instructions on how to use these things. So this is a very important part. We want to emphasize that all the time to artists.
Now, I do want to go back a little bit and say then we do understand some of you absolutely love lead white and absolutely understand why is that important, but some of you absolutely not. So, and we understand that and we respect that, and that's why we are telling you. So if you don't want to use the lead white, it's absolutely okay. These days we do have other white colors which people in previous centuries didn't. So some of them unfortunately don't give the same ability.
Benefits
yes.
in oil paint.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in oil, yes. Again, let's emphasize, and it's only
it's
on
in oil.
oils.
That's what we're talking about.
And if lead white is not for you, so it's okay too. So, but we do have now in our company, which if you will ask me 5 years ago, I will absolutely swear and tell you then we would not touch titanium. But again, even titanium we make certain way, what many of you know, then we don't put any additives. So our titanium will behave completely different. And I do know it was couple questions about will titanium lead behave the same, slightly different, but again it will be as long. We already covered that in September session, first part of the when we talk about lead whites. The second part will be here in October coming, and I will cover all our pure leads, single pigments, because in September it was mixes, and it was historical mixes as much as actually titanium. But so stay tuned for October, and I just now, since I took the word from George, so I just want to thank all of you here, and especially ones who try to write in Russian and or with Russian translator. So thank you very much. It's a very nice day for me started today. So, and another question I had, why do we call our line of colors Rublev? And it's actually come up very logical. We started as our company as a natural pigments because we wanted to give artists different sets of pigments, not synthetic modern colors, but colors what were used by in previous centuries. And fortunately for us, we just basically attempt all historical colors. But very quickly we understood, and we can't just call the natural pigments. So then under natural pigments you can read its historical colors, because lead white is not natural, and some of the very important historical colors are not natural. So it's why we call natural historical too. And the name Rublev come again logical, because our company, we started as a non-profit organization. It's called Iconophile, with iconographers. and to take the name Rublev, who was 15th century artist, iconographer, monk, and so he painted probably the most important icons, not only for Russians in Orthodox world, but for whole world. It's Trinity, and so it's called Rublev Trinity. And so, since we were working first, probably like 3 to 5 years, only strictly with iconographers who paint egg tempera, so we took that name. And of course, when we started make our oil colors much later, so we decided just to drag that name with us. And I do understand it's a little bit upsetting for Russians, because in Russia you can't take that name because it was historical person. I mean, it's historical name for real person who exists, and so by law in Russia you can't. And here it's unusual case where here in United States we took Russian name, but it is American company. We make all our colors we make here. So that's the answer. And it's not to emphasize the historical aspects. It's not the case, and it's not why we did this. It just happened like this.
And it's also to honor that great artist.
Absolutely.
And so he was a great artist, and we wanted to honor his memory. There was a question.
I know Nick is already writing 3 times. Let's answer that one. Nick.
So Nick,
we are preparing right now Cinnabar. It will be available. Yes.
So yeah, we have a production of Cinnabar going through our process now, and it's a very nice pigment. And by the way, for those of you who do not know this, but vermilion is red mercuric sulfide. It is a synthetic red mercuric sulfide, and is the most important bright red pigment in history. And so that's what vermilion is, a synthetic form, and is probably the most common form of that pigment in historical painting. But Cinnabar is the natural mineral, so in its natural state. And that particular mineral is also red mercuric sulfide. So we're going to be introducing a paint that can be used in place of vermilion. So and that is Cinnabar. So look for that. Probably, I would suspect by November timeframe, we'll have some of that available. Was there other
Yes.
questions?
Here's Uncle 60 is asking if...
So what happens when I mix lead white with regular titanium white?
That one, so I basically answered.
Okay.
It will be more opaque. So
And brighter, more
Yes.
more opacity and brighter, and there's some advantages in doing that, especially if you want
but read the other one, George,
greater
next
opacity.
one after that.
The next one, let me see.
So you scrape the white flakes. Yeah.
Will it flow if I mix it? Yes. But again, keep in mind that the modern lead white does not have the same characteristics as the stacked process lead white. And we've noticed that when you add titanium has unfortunately very poor body in oil paint. And that's why it's often and probably the most common form, rather than making a tube of pure titanium pigment, they often put a filler into it. Of course, most companies at one point were using zinc white to counter it, and so to counter some of the poor body as well as the color of the titanium, because the titanium actually also yellows. And so zinc white actually prevents that, and that's the one benefit of zinc white, but unfortunately it has this terrible effect of making oil paint very brittle. And so that's why it will not have the same flow characteristics when you mix the two together.
So while you're reading the last one, I will answer for Uncle 60,
Which-
another one. So I even repost for you, George, Uncle 30. You scrape the white flakes of the lead when grind the flakes. Any other fillers added it to as a white chalk? Absolutely not. Not in stack
In the stack
lead.
process?
Yes.
No. There are, of course, historically, the pigment manufacturers often adulterated these pigments. They initially, very early on, they used chalk to adulterate it. Then later in the 19th century, they used barium sulfate or barite to adulterate these pigments. And unbeknownst to the artists, they would sell it as pure lead white, but it was already adulterated, which was unfortunate. So that was always an issue. But no, we don't put anything else in the stack lead white. It's just pure oil and stack pigment.
And another question from Uncle 60. Do you make lead any other colors? Absolutely. If all companies in the world are trying right now to go away from heavy metals, we are going back to lead colors. We do have a range of lead colors. Please visit our website, naturalpigments.com. And you can find on a range of white colors in oil. It's very easy to find. Or you can just type on the search on the right corner of the screen.
There was a question here, when you pull the brush off, will this paint leave desired peaks? And if you're referring to, of course, the stack process, yes, it will. You can manipulate it in such a way where it can do certain things. And again, a lot of this will depend batch to batch, because again, it's because of the way this is made, and this has always been the case with stack process lead white. There was always variability. So the effects that you may see in one batch may be different in another batch.
Jose Alan Medina, are the modern methods to make lead white too hard to make in a smaller scale? You cannot believe. My husband actually started think about this, and so I think by December he already is trying to produce first batch based on modern methods. So you are looking right in target.
There is another question here. Is there any benefit in just using lead ground versus using a lead white throughout a painting? Well, if you understand what a lead ground is, lead grounds typically are formulated with extender pigments in order to increase the absorbency of the ground. And so whereas you can use a lead ground throughout a painting, there probably is very little advantage in doing that in particular. Because you may not need or even have the desire or want to have an additional or increased absorbency throughout the painting, because this actually could lead to sinking in.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me do this one. Another one from Marcia.
Okay.
Is it correct to say that the pigment size of stack white is too large to pass through the skin? Well, actually, this would be true for any pigment. The pigments, except for perhaps nanoparticle pigments, and they don't actually pass through. The nanoparticles actually don't pass through the skin, but they can actually enter a cell wall. And that's why they were at one point introducing titanium white and nanoparticles as a invisible ultraviolet light absorber, or as a skin. I'm trying to look for the word. Skin protection from light, and so they couldn't release that because, of course, they found the titanium white passing through the cell walls. But pigments themselves do not pass through the skin. The skin has many layers, and by the way, there's an article about this. About skin absorption of pigment particles on the Painting Best Practice website. I talk about that. It's unlikely that pigment particles or any paint will pass through your skin because there are 7 layers of skin that offer this kind of protection. The only way to do this is if you had a break in your skin, abrasion or a cut, and then it could expose your blood vessels, in which case then you would absorb some of that lead. But lead is not easily absorbed through the skin at all. There may be certain conditions where it can be, because in fact lead is not soluble in water, or not easily soluble in water, unless there is, of course, other things present like acids, where it then can be dissolved in the water. Another question, Tanya, that you saw?
Connie, what is the difference between flake lead white and lead white number 1? Connie, we will have a session on October 13th here in YouTube and in Facebook about it's specifically we will talk about these colors, but on short answer will be stock lead has a different particle size, and lead because lead white number 1 is modern lead white, and stock lead we are making here on old methods. So here's another question from Elizabeth. Is it safe to accidentally ingest titanium oil linseed? No lead, asking for very messy students. They will not die.
Ingesting titanium?
Yes.
Well, titanium is used in food, although
Yes.
not the
Best.
pigments that is commonly. So there's certain pigments or titanium pigments that are then approved by the FDA, and then they can be used in food. But the pigments used in paint is not that type. And although I don't know of any toxicity, although in the state of California, it is listed as a hazardous substance in Prop 65, but the hazard comes through breathing large amounts or inhaling large amounts of titanium powder. So that's why it's important to read safety data sheets, so you can understand, because people read titanium, which is everywhere in every product, and then they think it's actually toxic, but it's only toxic in certain forms. There's another question here from
Yes.
Max.
Uh-huh.
How does Cinnabar compare with lead in terms of toxicity? Because, so again, Cinnabar and vermilion are both, and by the way, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a toxicologist, so we do recommend always consulting with your doctor or your toxicologist in all cases, so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on. Those are the experts. But what I do say, and what I can say from our own studies and our own findings, is that that there is Cinnabar and vermilion are considered to be toxic substances, but not as toxic as perhaps even lead, and certainly not as toxic as the metal mercury. And there's an article that I wrote in, on the Natural Pigments website. We talk about the toxicity of vermilion, and through actual tests that we did with the Johns Hopkins University. And so we found that it doesn't, under certain conditions, it doesn't dissolve in the types of acids found in stomachs. But, however, we don't know everything that goes on in the stomach, and so we do not recommend eating Cinnabar or ingesting it in any form whatsoever. But because it's a sulfide, it does present less toxicity overall. Is there another question?
So, yes, here's Catherine Davila. Is the supply of lead tin yellow affected also? No. Catherine, we buy our lead tin yellow from one small company in Europe, and they historically were making this in very small batches anyway. So that will not affect, and so it will not affect the price of that pigment too. So we still continue. And you see, guys who know us for so many years, then George is going out of his way so to figure out pigments for you, because when vermilion was growing in price, and we still were keeping sane, at least prices for. So now we lost vermilion. So he is, believe or not, he's trying to figure out now how to make vermilion here. It will probably take for him some time to make this safely here on the, but I'm sure he will figure out some way. But meanwhile, we will sell Cinnabar. And Dmitry, you are right. So then light fastness of the PR83 of the Cinnabar is
That's alizarin crimson.
Oh, he's talking about alizarin crimson.
Mm-hmm.
So this is that's
PR83.
Oh, 83.
Yeah.
One. So
Six,
it's completely different. So,
but that's
yes.
Of course, alizarin crimson is not a natural pigment.
Yes.
But it is not as light fast, and of course that's been well recognized.
And Cinnabar as the vermilion reacting again different. And you're absolutely right, because I misunderstood them. So in certain cases, vermilion and Cinnabar are darkened in history. It happened not that many times. Then just to in order to avoid that pigment completely, it's not worth it. It's beautiful red pigment. So
another question: Flemish white is produced by modern method? Yes, Flemish white is basically lead sulfate. So it's not lead white. It's not there in our Flemish white. And by the way, Flemish white is not a pigment. It's just a name that was adopted in the 19th century to designate lead sulfate, which is very different from lead white. So just keep that in mind. But this the lead sulfate that we use in our Flemish white is a modern method. Okay, let's go on to another question.
Here's Ben. Yeah.
Okay.
Valentine.
Would non-visible traces of lead from paint still be dangerous? Yes.
Yes.
I painted with lead for years, but still have paranoia about non-visible traces. And well, that's what I recommended, is to get a lead test kit to determine whether there's lead available. And also, it's a good idea to have your blood tested for lead, just to make sure that that you're being safe and that you're following recommended procedures. So we always encourage this. We never want to have any of our artists become ill as a result of the toxicity of lead.
George, I reposted for Brecht.
Okay, you're
the last one. You can look in my.
Okay.
So. Could you elaborate on the metal soaps and modern lead white? You mentioned a difference concerning metal soaps between stock and modern lead. It's actually not with stock and modern, but it's more likely lead and zinc. So both of these pigments.
So metal soaps can originate from a number of different types of pigments. And I mentioned zinc is one, lead white, and it also lead tin yellow has been noted to have metal soaps, or to create or form metal soaps. But also metal soaps come from other sources, such as litharge, and black oil is a source of lead soaps. In fact, that's basically what it consists of: oil and some lead soaps. And the study that I mentioned determined, for instance, that lead soaps will form from litharge in walnut oil at room temperature in a short period of time, and at elevated temperatures almost immediately. So, which of course is how black oil is made. So the formation of these lead soaps can occur, or metal soaps can occur from that. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that we still don't understand completely. We do know that lead soaps can lead to degradation, but we do not understand exactly the role of the intent, of course, how artists were using or adding these materials, or the manufacturers adding these materials. As an example, manufacturers have added stearates into these into oil paints since the beginning of the 20th century. And the stearates do form soaps with many of these materials. And this is, by the way, some of the lead soaps they're found are actually stearates, as well as soaps from oleic acid and palmitic acids. So this is also part of this whole issue. And again, the understanding of this is not complete at this point in time, and until we do understand more, we'll be able to get a better handle on how these things can occur. I know Virgil listening. Thank you, Virgil, for reminding that metal soaps from stabilizers. That is of course part of the problem. Part of the problem is the efflorescence that do occur as a result of these kinds of metal soaps. Let me see
so
here.
Here's Ben. He said, and I got tested recently and was well below standard. We actually encourage you, if you do paint with lead, and so instead of sleepless nights, just go to doctor. It's very easy check. Or if you don't want to go to doctor about, so now they have even saliva tests. It's very easy again. So you take your saliva, you send to lab, and lab will notify you by email actually when it's ready. So I can tell you this: George works with Pigment, lead white, tons a year, and one of our employees just dedicated to lead white only, and so we test them yearly. And even with the pigment, their blood test is below than even like children's norm. So for those of you who even have a question, don't hesitate, just go and check yourself, and so then that will just make you feel better if and by the way, these days we actually do have methods of cleaning body from the lead, and so it's very painful, very costly, but it still could be done. So then if that is your concern.
Okay.
So we have.
There was a question about we didn't talk about the toxicity of cadmiums.
Yes.
Again,
it's next program.
That's probably something we can talk about later. The only thing to keep in mind about this is that the cadmiums have been classified as a class 1B carcinogen, which means that when animals are tested with this pigment, they developed cancer, and so this class 1B carcinogens doesn't necessarily, although it may be an indication, doesn't necessarily mean that humans develop cancer as a result of the use of cadmiums. But again, the cadmium is a cadmium sulfide, and sulfide pigments are much less, have much less bioavailability to the body as opposed to cadmiums in other forms. And by the way, the largest form or usage of cadmiums today is in, of course, your phones and in computers, where you have nickel cadmium battery being used in many, many areas. So the pigment represents the in the industry really the least danger to humans today. Let me see here.
So,
another question. Do we want to?
I saw something in Facebook actually. We didn't.
There's a question. This is about white, but someday do you produce a violet oil paint similar to colors of cobalt or dioxazine? Yes, we are going to be producing a cobalt violet. We will not produce a dioxazine purple or any kind of organic pigments. We may in the future, but at this point in time, because of the recent information in regards to the standards for the testing standards for light fastness in artist paints, we decided not to produce these pigments until this standard has been revised and the testing has been revised. Right now, there is a big question, and I'm not saying that organic pigments are not light fast, but what we are saying is we actually don't know which ones are light fast and not, based on information that the ASTM subcommittee on artist materials have been considering during the past couple of years, in which I've talked about this extensively to groups of artists, and we urge, and I just wanted to say this, we urge the other manufacturers besides just natural pigments and golden artist colors to get on board with this and help in revising the standard and doing the tests.
And I do know Virgil is talking very often on his page about the light fastness too, about this concern. So thank you, Virgil. And I know you support us on this aspect. And Elaine Davis, Flemish white is produced by modern method as well.
I answered that one. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay,
yeah,
good.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay, so
yeah, I
guess,
think I'm trying to look through some of our questions here.
So again, reminder, today stock lead is open for public. We send the news. We send the notices to people who waited over a year, so then who wanted to buy before already bought, and so today it's for for public. And lead white number 1 and number 2 will be available probably after October 15th. So we will try to do this right about, because on October 13th we will have another session, part 2, lead whites and pale shade of whites. Yes, is that how it was called? It's AMA.
So yes, so I forgot the date.
October 13th.
October 13th. Tanya, artist material advisor, will talk on the subject, a paler shade of white, which is the second part of what we discussed in September, and we're going to focus on leads, and we're going to show you all the different lead whites that we make and how they perform, the opacity, and we'll have more information, and of course we'll be closer to the date of when it will be available, so we'll have probably even better news for all of you at that point in time. So we want to thank you for participating here, and
thank you for my congratulations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And we'll be seeing you in a short while. Thank you.